So we talked a little bit about different types of data and how we might work with it. One of the most common types of data you work with is just simple text data, usually in text files. So let's take a little look at how we might work with text data. So earlier on, we showed that we had these data files, and what those files might actually contain is just some text. So here's an example of some text. It's a description of a product from a bicycle retailer, and they're selling this frame, and it's a description of the frame, and it's got information about its price and so on. Now that data is what we would call unstructured. It's really just a big blob of text that we've got in there, some information about the bike. So it's something that we can do some work with, but it's quite hard to kind of process that in any kind of structured format. So one of the things you'll quite often see is data that is structured in a text file, usually by delimiting different columns or fields. So we've got these attributes of the data, the product, the description, and its price, and we'll delimit those columns. And we're delimiting in this case using a comma. So there's a comma between each of the product names, the descriptions, and the price. And we've got a new line for each different product or for each record, each row. So you can think of this as being a kind of text representation of a table where the commas are delimiting the columns and a new line is delimiting the rows. That's quite a common way of doing it. You could use any delimiters you like. It's quite common to see spaces or tabs used instead of commas for delimiting the columns. But in this case, we've got some structure to the data. I can see that apart from the first row, which contains the names of the columns, each of the other rows effectively just contains a product name, a description, and a price. So let's take a look at working with delimited text. So here I am in Microsoft Excel. It's a fairly commonly used application for working with data. And I'm going to import some text into this spreadsheet. So to do that, I'm going to go to my Data tab here, and I'll just say I want to get some text from text or CSV. CSV is comma separated values. Now in this case, the data that I'm going to load isn't actually comma separated. It's separated using tabs. I'll show you what that data looks like. Let's go to the folder, and it is here. So we'll open it up in a text editor, and you can see that it's actually tab delimited. I've got the product name, a culture ID, which is the identification for the country and region that I'm having the description from, the description, which will be English or some other language description of the product, and the list price. And then we've got the data tab delimited in that file. So I want to import this into my Excel workbook. There's lots of different places I could import data from. In this case, I'm just going to simply take it from text or CSV. There's my products file. I'll go ahead and import. And Excel goes and takes a look at that file and realizes, well, hey, this looks like it's in this particular format. We'll talk a little bit about encodings later on. But it's delimited by tab. So it recognizes the tab is the thing that delimits the different columns, and it's basing that on looking at the first 200 rows. Now I could try and correct that and tell it, well, actually it's delimited by comma, but it's going to take a look, and that's not really going to work properly. You can see the column 1 has all of the column headers in there. So we just make sure we use the right delimiter. We'll use tab, and then we can go ahead and load that data into our spreadsheet. So when I do that, it goes and gets the data and then creates my table. So I'm ready to now work with that data, and I could filter this so that I only see the ones that are perhaps in English, like that. So I've now got data that I can work with and I can process. So that's an example of working with delimited text, and that's something that when you work with data, you'll probably do quite often. Now, delimited text is useful. It's a nice, easy way to understand our structured data, particularly if it's in a kind of tabular type structure. But sometimes our data is going to be in more complex structures than that, and we perhaps want to think about different ways of representing data entities using text. So let's take a look at an alternative approach. So one way we could do this is using a technology called Extensible Markup Language, or XML. Now this was very popular in the late 90s and into the 2000s. It was a really popular way of representing data. It's still very widely used. And the way that it works is we have these different elements. So you can see here's an order element, which contains 2 item elements. And those elements themselves contain attributes. So we've got an invoice number attribute for the order, and we've got ID, price, and quantity attributes for the different items within the order. So you can see that I've got this structure here, and it allows me to represent things like parent-child relationships, hierarchies of data, rather than just simple rows and columns. So it's quite a flexible way of doing that. and it's widely understood by a lot of technologies that are used on the internet. So let's just take a quick look at an actual XML file. So in this case, I've got an XML file called order.xml, and I've opened that in Visual Studio. There are lots of tools that you can use to work with XML. And you can see that Visual Studio recognizes this as an XML file. It's recognized it's using color coding to tell me which things are the elements and which things are the attributes. I've got attribute names here, and then the values of those attributes are there in quotations. You can see again, I've specified the version of XML I'm using and the encoding. We'll talk again about encoding a bit later. And you can see that because I've got elements here, Visual Studio recognizes those things. So there's some structure, there's some ability to parse that XML and make sense out of the structure of the data. And Visual Studio is doing that in the background. And you can write applications, you can write programs and write your own code that will parse the XML and make sense of that structure and navigate your complex data structures. So XML then is a fairly widely used approach to working with data that can be structured or even semi-structured. It might not, every element might not have exactly the same attributes and so on, but you can kind of see how we might use XML to work with data. Now, there are some reasons that that's not as commonly used as it perhaps used to be, and really that's because it's actually quite verbose. You have these element tags that there's quite a lot of text involved in there, and parsing that can be quite difficult to work with. So we're looking for something that's perhaps a little bit less verbose and a little bit easier to parse and work with. And there is an alternative technology that's used quite a lot for formatting data. Let's take a look at that. So we're going to look at something called JavaScript Object Notation, or JSON is what it's commonly abbreviated as. And here's another representation of that sales order that we saw in XML. And it's slightly less verbose. There's slightly less text involved in doing this. You can see that I've got these braces that indicate the order, and then I've got my invoice number and the actual number. And you can see that I haven't put quotations around the number. It's recognized as a number, so it knows about the data types. And then we've got our items, and that's a collection of items. So we've got a little square bracket there to see here's a collection of these things, and then each item is within a brace. So we've got our ID, price, and quantity for each item listed in there. It's a slightly more succinct way of describing the data, and it's natively understood by languages like JavaScript. There's lots of parsers for JSON out there, and JavaScript is where this kind of structure came from. So if we need to serialize objects that we're programming as a text format, as a kind of stream of data structures, then we can do that using JSON quite easily. It's a very efficient way of persisting data to either to a file or to send it across the network between different components of an application. So that's our JSON. Let's take a look at an actual JSON document. So again, here I am in Visual Studio, and you can see that I've got this order.json file here. And again, Visual Studio recognizes the different entities within that. So I'm able to go and work my way through those objects. So I've got the actual order itself, which I could expand out. It has an invoice number, and it has a collection of items. And I can expand the collection of items and see, well, there's two of those things. And that first one has these attributes, and that second one has these attributes. So again, we're able to make logical sense of the structure of the data by working with this JSON file. So there you have it, a number of ways of working with data structures just in simple text files, either plain straightforward text that's just unstructured, or we can structure it by delimiting it, creating delimited files that represent tables of values, or we can create more complex structures using techniques like XML or JSON. And these are all formats that you're likely to come across when you're working with data.